My name is Howard Hughes. When I died in April of 1976, the FBI had to use my fingerprints to identify the body. I weighed 90 pounds. I was 6 feet 4 inches tall. I had spent the last 20 years of my life in darkened hotel rooms, wearing tissue boxes on my feet, and I had not spoken to anyone who was not on my payroll in longer than I can precisely remember. I owned Hollywood. Then I locked myself in a room and never came out. In April of 1976, a body arrived at Methodist Hospital in Houston on a chartered Learjet. The FBI was called to identify it. The man had been one of the wealthiest people on Earth, an aviator, a filmmaker, an engineer who had designed aircraft and broken records, and owned studios and casinos and resorts and a Las Vegas skyline. His name was Howard Hughes. He weighed 90 pounds. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall. His hair and beard were uncut. There were 5 broken hypodermic needles embedded in the flesh of his arms. The FBI used his fingerprints because his face was unrecognizable. I am Howard Hughes, and I want to tell you how a man gets from there, from the cockpit of the world's fastest aircraft, from the set of a film that pushed the censors to their limit, from the penthouse of a Las Vegas hotel empire that he purchased casino by casino until he owned the skyline, to a Learjet over northern Mexico, 90 pounds, unrecognizable, identified by fingerprint. It is not a simple story. It is not a story about hubris or excess or the inevitable fall of a man who reached too high. It is a story about a disease that was present from the beginning and never named, that grew in the specific way that untreated things grow, slowly, then completely, until the room it built was the only world that remained. I built Hollywood. I built the room. I am here to explain the distance between those two things, in my own words, without the tissue boxes being the punchline. They were never the punchline. They were the endpoint of a logic that began in Houston, Texas, in a house where my mother Aline checked me for polio every single day, and that ran, uninterrupted and unnamed, for 70 years. Let me tell you where the room came from, because the room did not arrive without a history. It was built over decades, constructed incrementally from materials that were present from the very beginning. From a childhood in Houston, Texas, in a house where my mother Aline checked me every day for signs of polio. Every single day. She examined me the way you might examine a piece of fruit for rot, systematically, anxiously, with the specific attention of someone who believed that disease was present everywhere, and that her vigilance was the only thing standing between her son and catastrophe. She made me scrub myself with antiseptic. She monitored what I ate. She was terrified of germs in the specific, total, unrelenting way that only a very frightened parent can be, and she passed that terror to me the way you pass down eye color or height, through proximity, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of a worldview in which contamination is always present and cleanliness is never quite sufficient. My father, Howard Sr., was a different kind of inheritance. He invented the Hughes rotary drill bit, a piece of engineering so precisely conceived that it could pierce granite, which the existing bits could not, and which made him wealthy enough that he chose not to sell it, but to lease it, collecting royalties that built the Hughes Tool Company, and the fortune that became mine at 18, when both my parents were dead within 2 years of each other. My mother, Aline, died when I was 16. My father died when I was 18. I was a billionaire orphan with complete control of a fortune and no one to answer to, and an inherited terror of germs, and a mind that, left entirely to itself and its own momentum, produced results that were simultaneously brilliant and catastrophic, and, in the end, terminal. I want to be clear about what the OCD actually felt like from inside it, because the public version, the tissue boxes, the darkened rooms, the fingernails, tends to function as entertainment, as eccentricity, as the quirky endpoint of a genius gone too far. It was not entertainment from inside it. It was a logic so total and so internally consistent that it was almost impossible to argue with. The germs were real. The contamination was real. The danger was present and constant, and the only defense against it was vigilance. Rituals, barriers, procedures, the elaborate architecture of a controlled environment in which the variables of exposure could be managed. That was the reasoning. That was always the reasoning. And the reasoning was perfectly sound as far as it went. The problem was that it never stopped going. What I built in my 20s and 30s, the films, the aircraft, the speed records, the fortune, was built by the same mind that eventually built the room. The same perfectionism, the same demand for total control, the same inability to leave a problem partially solved. The difference was only direction, and for a long time, the direction was outward. Then something happened that turned it inward, and inward was where it stayed. I arrived in Hollywood in 1925 with my father's money and no particular plan except that I intended to make films and that the films I made would be the best films anyone had ever made. That was not humility speaking. Humility was not a trait I possessed in any significant quantity. But it was also not empty boasting. I had the specific certainty of someone whose mind worked at a speed and with a precision that he had not yet found the limits of. And Hollywood in 1925 was an industry that was still being invented, which meant that a man with money and perfectionism and an absolute refusal to leave anything at the level of merely adequate had genuine room to operate. Hell's Angels took 3 years and cost $3,800,000, which was an almost incomprehensible sum for a film in 1930. I employed 17,000 people. I acquired 87 aircraft. I hired and then fired the director Howard Hawks and took over myself because Hawks was not getting it right, and I was not capable of leaving something unright once I had identified where the problem was. 3 pilots died during production. The aerial sequences were unprecedented. The film was a sensation. The Los Angeles Times called it the most spectacular aviation picture ever made. I took note of the review and immediately began thinking about what would come next and how it could be better. That was always the structure. Achievement, assessment, dissatisfaction, the next thing. The next thing was always the thing that would finally be exactly right. It never was. Jane Russell and the bra deserve their own paragraph because they are the story that people tell about me most often, and because the story, as usually told, misses what was actually happening. I was directing The Outlaw in 1941, and I became fixated on the way Russell's blouse bunched along a seam. Not her figure, a seam. A specific technical flaw in the way fabric was behaving on camera, which produced a visual result that was incorrect, and which I could not leave incorrect because leaving incorrect things alone was not something my mind would permit. I applied my engineering background to the problem. I designed a cantilevered bra using curved structural steel rods sewn into the fabric under each cup, connected to the shoulder straps. I wrote detailed memoranda about the construction, and then Jane Russell wore her own bra, padded it with tissue, tightened the straps, came back to set, and I never noticed the difference. She said afterward, "I never wore it in The Outlaw, and he never knew. He wasn't going to take my clothes off to check if I had it on. I just told him I did." The bra I designed is in a museum now. It was never in a film. That is the most precise summary of a certain kind of perfectionism I know. The object built to solve a problem that then solved itself without the object, and the object preserved as testament to the effort regardless. What was happening underneath all of this, underneath the films and the aircraft and the bras built from structural steel, was a set of compulsions that were becoming, very gradually and then very rapidly, something I could no longer direct outward. The crashes accelerated it. The crashes were the turning point. And I need to tell you about the crashes. On July 7, 1946, I was test piloting the XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft over Beverly Hills when the right rear propeller went into reverse pitch. The plane went down. I crashed into 3 houses on Whittier Drive. The impact broke my left collarbone, fractured my skull in multiple places, cracked 6 ribs, collapsed my left lung, and shifted my heart to the right side of my chest. My body was so badly burned that the doctor at the scene, a surgeon named Lawrence Chaffin, who happened to live nearby, thought I would not survive the next hour. I survived. But I survived the way a piece of metal survives being put through a forge, as something measurably different from what it was before. The pain was immediate and permanent. I want you to understand what chronic, unrelenting pain does to a mind that was already operating under significant internal pressure, already managing the rituals, the contamination fears, the compulsions that had been growing since childhood, but were still, in 1946, sufficiently controlled that I could function publicly. The pain dissolved what control remained. The doctors gave me morphine in the hospital, and I understood, immediately, at the level of physical relief, why people became addicted to opiates. The relief was total. The pain was not. I left the hospital addicted to morphine. I transitioned to codeine because codeine was more manageable, more predictable, more amenable to the kind of systematic administration that my mind required of everything it engaged with. I calculated dosages the way I calculated aircraft specifications, precisely, obsessively, with complete attention to the variables. The calculation was wrong in the end, but it was very thorough. There had been other crashes before 1946. In 1943, an aircraft I was piloting on Lake Mead went down. In 1945, another crash. Each one added to the chronic pain inventory. Each one added another layer to the PTSD that the psychological autopsy conducted after my death identified as one of several overlapping conditions I was carrying simultaneously. The OCD, the traumatic brain injuries, the addiction, the deafness that was advancing steadily from an inherited condition called otosclerosis. By 1946, I was managing more simultaneous crises than any system, human or mechanical, was designed to handle. Something had to give. What gave, gradually and then completely, was the outward direction. The energy that had built Hell's Angels and broken the airspeed record and acquired RKO Pictures turned inward. And inward, for a mind like mine, was very crowded. The press did not see it happening because I would not let them see it. I controlled access to myself the way I controlled access to everything, completely, systematically, by ensuring that the information that reached the public was the information I had approved. That worked for a long time. Then it stopped working. And what the press eventually saw, when they saw anything at all, was not what I had become. It was the last photograph, taken years before, of who I used to be. In November of 1966, I arrived in Las Vegas by private railroad car on Thanksgiving Day and moved into the Desert Inn. I want you to understand the specific quality of that arrival, because it was not, on the surface, the arrival of a man in decline. It was the arrival of one of the wealthiest men in America, traveling in his own railroad car, moving into the penthouse of a major hotel casino, about to begin one of the most concentrated acquisition campaigns in the history of Nevada real estate. Within 2 years, I would own the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Castaways, the New Frontier, the Landmark Hotel and Casino, and the Silver Slipper. I owned a television station. I owned an airport. I owned so much of Las Vegas that the governor of Nevada called me the most powerful man in the state. From the outside, this looked like expansion. From the inside, it was something considerably different. I bought the Desert Inn because the management wanted me to leave, and I would not leave. That is the transaction in its entirety. They asked me to vacate the penthouse to make room for high rollers during the New Year's holiday, and rather than move, I purchased the hotel. I then had the 9th floor penthouse sealed. The drapes were not open during the years I lived there. When I finally left in 1966, hotel employees discovered that the drapes had rotted through from disuse. I had been in that penthouse, with rotting drapes and sealed windows, conducting a financial empire by telephone and memorandum, and I had not gone outside. Not once. The most powerful man in Nevada had not been outside. The memos were their own architecture. I wrote instructions detailing how my staff should wash their hands, the precise number of times, the specific soap, the duration. I wrote instructions for how to open a can of peaches. Remove the label, scrub the can until it becomes bare metal. Then, and only then, open it. I specified the number of Kleenex tissues that should be used when handing me any object. 4 tissues, folded in a specific configuration, so that the object could be passed without my skin making contact with another person's skin or with any surface that had not been prepared according to my specifications. My staff followed these instructions because I paid them to follow these instructions, and because by that point, my ability to enforce compliance was essentially absolute. I was aware, at some level, that the instructions were not normal. I was not able to not give them. What I was building in Las Vegas was not an empire. It was a controlled environment. The hotels, the casinos, the television station, the airport. They were the walls of the room I was constructing around myself. I was buying a world small enough that I could manage its variables. And when even that world became too large to manage, I reduced it further, and then further still, until what remained was one room, one bed, one window covered so completely that I could not tell if it was day or night. That was the room. That was where I was going. I just didn't know it yet. The room was wherever I was. That is the first thing to understand about the final years. It was not a specific location. It was a condition that I carried from hotel to hotel, across a decade of increasingly desperate relocation. The Beverly Hills Hotel, the Desert Inn, the Britannia Beach Hotel in Nassau, the Xanadu Princess in Freeport, the Inn on the Park in London, the Intercontinental in Managua, the Acapulco Princess in Mexico, where I was when the end finally arrived. 10 years of moving, always to the top floor penthouse, always with the curtains drawn and the windows sealed, and the same conditions reproduced in each new location as precisely as I could reproduce them. The room traveled with me. I was the room. I want to describe what the room actually was, because the descriptions that circulated after my death tended toward the sensational and away from the specific. And the specific is what I can offer. The room was dark. Not dimly lit, dark, with blackout curtains that allowed no light from outside. I lay in bed without clothing, because clothing was a contamination vector, and I had concluded that the safest position was direct contact with surfaces I had personally approved. I wore tissue boxes on my feet when I needed to walk, because the floor was contaminated and my feet could not touch it directly. I watched films, the same films, repeatedly. Sometimes the same film dozens of times in sequence. Ice Station Zebra, the 1968 submarine thriller, which I watched 150 times. I am not certain why that film specifically. The submarine, perhaps. A sealed environment, total control of access, the crew knowing exactly who was permitted inside and who was not. My staff delivered food according to protocols I had specified. Despite these protocols, I ate very little. The codeine had eliminated most of my appetite. I consumed chocolate bars with some regularity because they came in factory-sealed wrappers that had not been touched by anyone in my immediate environment. My teeth rotted and fell out because I never brushed them. The germaphobe who had spent decades constructing elaborate protocols to avoid contamination had stopped performing the most basic hygiene because the act of hygiene itself had become too contaminated to execute. That is the paradox that the medical literature eventually identified as the specific variant of OCD that consumed me. Contamination fear so severe that it produced the very contamination it feared, because the rituals required to stay clean had become themselves a source of contamination anxiety. The needles in my arms tell the rest of the story. When they X-rayed my body after death, they found 5 broken hypodermic needles embedded in the flesh of my arms. The remnants of glass syringes with metal needles that I had insisted on using to inject the codeine, because glass and metal could be sterilized and plastic could not. The needles broke off because I had been using them so long in the same sites that the flesh had hardened. I could not change the injection sites because changing them would have required a recalculation of the protocol, and recalculating the protocol was not something I was capable of doing by the end. The room had its own logic. The room always had its own logic. I was worth $2.5 billion when I died. I want to stay with that number for a moment because it is the central irony of everything I am telling you. The man who could buy hotels to avoid being asked to leave them who purchased Las Vegas casino by casino until he owned the skyline, who had the resources to construct any physical environment he could conceive, died of malnutrition and kidney failure, weighing 90 pounds in a chartered Learjet over northern Mexico. The money could buy the room. It could not buy what the room was supposed to provide. It could not buy the silence inside my own head. The women came before the room. Katharine Hepburn, with whom I had a relationship that was, for a period, genuinely mutual and genuinely sustaining. Two people of comparable intelligence and comparable stubbornness finding in each other something they had not found elsewhere. Katharine understood the compulsions before they were fully formed, which is to say she understood them when they were still interesting rather than terminal. She left eventually, as everyone did, because the compulsions demanded total accommodation, and total accommodation is not something that a person with their own interior life can provide indefinitely. After Katharine came Ava Gardner, and Lana Turner, and Rita Hayworth, and a long procession of women whose beauty I catalogued with the same systematic attention I applied to aircraft specifications. I was not capable of the ordinary dailiness of a relationship. I was capable of intensity and acquisition, and the specific kind of attention that functions as intimacy without being it. The deafness advanced alongside everything else. My hearing had been compromised since childhood by otosclerosis, a condition in which abnormal bone growth in the middle ear progressively restricts the movement of the bones that conduct sound. By the 1960s, I was significantly deaf, which compounded the isolation in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. The world had become not only contaminated, but inaudible. My staff communicated with me increasingly in writing. I responded in writing. The telephone calls became shorter and less frequent, and then, for long stretches, stopped entirely. I had constructed a world in which no unrequested input could reach me, and then the world itself began to go quiet in ways that were not of my choosing. And the silence that remained was not the controlled silence I had built, but the uncontrolled silence of a man who was losing his ability to receive the world on any terms at all. The psychological autopsy that Raymond Fowler conducted after my death reconstructed a portrait from my staff's testimony, from court depositions, from telephone transcripts, from pilot logs, from letters my mother Aline had written about me as a child. He spent years on it. What he found, going back to the beginning, was a pattern so consistent and so early established that it was difficult to identify a point at which intervention might have changed the direction. The room had been under construction since the first time Aline checked me for polio. It just took 70 years to complete. In 1966, I moved into the Desert Inn and did not go outside again. That is the decade in its simplest summary. 10 years of hotels, each one darker and more sealed than the last, the protocols becoming more elaborate as the ability to enforce them became more compromised. The staff reduced to a small group of aides who managed my physical needs with the specific detachment of people who had learned not to engage with the logic of what they were doing, but simply to execute it. They brought the food in sealed containers. They handed me documents wrapped in the specified number of Kleenex tissues. They did not touch me. Nobody touched me. For 10 years, nobody touched Howard Hughes. The CIA found me useful during this period. In 1972, they needed a cover for an operation to secretly recover a sunken Soviet submarine, K-129, from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. They came to me because a billionaire conducting deep-sea mining operations at extreme depths was a plausible explanation for the surface ships and equipment required. I provided the cover. From my sealed penthouse, with the blackout curtains and the tissue boxes and the codeine protocols and the rotting drapes, I provided logistical cover for a Cold War intelligence operation. The CIA found the arrangement satisfactory. The films ran continuously. Ice Station Zebra played 150 times. The submarine film, the sealed environment, the crew that controlled access absolutely. There was a logic to it that I understood. The appeal of a world small enough to be controlled completely. The fantasy of a space in which contamination was impossible because the doors were sealed and the variables were known, and nothing could enter that had not been approved. That was the room I was trying to build. The film showed me a version of it that worked. I made one public statement in 1972. A man named Clifford Irving had published a book claiming to be based on my memoirs, an entirely fabricated document with forged correspondence. I held a telephone press conference to state that the book was fraudulent and that I had never spoken to Irving. The press conference lasted 3 hours. Afterward, I returned to the room and did not speak publicly again. On April 5, 1976, I was in Acapulco. I had not left the penthouse in weeks. My body had reached a point that my staff recognized as requiring medical intervention they could not provide. They arranged a Learjet. The plan was to fly me to Methodist Hospital in Houston. I died on the plane over northern Mexico at 1:27 in the afternoon. I was 70 years old. I weighed 90 pounds. The FBI used my fingerprints to confirm who I was because my face was unrecognizable. That is the precise and complete summary of where the room eventually led. The autopsy was performed at Methodist Hospital in Houston on April 6, 1976. I want to walk you through what they found because the findings constitute the most accurate biography of my final decade that exists. More accurate than any newspaper account. More accurate than the testimony of any staff member. More accurate than the psychological autopsy that Raymond Fowler spent years constructing from secondary sources. The body tells the truth in ways that the mind, particularly a mind like mine, learns very early to obscure. I weighed 90 pounds. My frame was 6 feet 4 inches, the same frame that had sat in cockpits and walked film sets and shook hands with senators and governors and the heads of studios. 90 pounds on that frame meant that I had shrunk measurably in height, that the musculature had consumed itself, that what remained was essentially skeletal. The official cause of death was kidney failure. The kidneys fail when the body has been running on insufficient nutrition and chronic dehydration for long enough that they can no longer perform their basic functions. A slow and entirely preventable process that requires sustained neglect across an extended period of time to achieve. I had achieved it. The malnutrition and the codeine and the bed sores and the broken needles in my arms. 5 of them, embedded in hardened flesh, visible on X-ray, constituted a body that had been treated, by the man inhabiting it, as a contamination risk rather than as a home. The 18-month private investigation commissioned by my estate produced a finding that has never been fully resolved. The investigators concluded that someone had administered a lethal injection of codeine to my comatose body, that the final dose was not self-administered, but was given by a person or persons unknown, almost certainly with the knowledge that it would be fatal. The official cause of death remained kidney failure. The question of whether the kidney failure was accelerated by a deliberate act has never been answered with the certainty that a legal proceeding would require. I leave that question where it has always been, open, documented, unresolved, another room that nobody wanted to enter. What I want to tell you about the autopsy is not the forensics, but what the forensics imply about the distance between what I was and what I became. The man who set the airspeed record in 1935, who flew around the world in 3 days and 19 hours and 14 minutes, who designed aircraft and built studios and broke every boundary that presented itself. That man died of malnutrition in a chartered jet because he had not eaten enough for long enough that his kidneys stopped. The distance between those two facts is not a moral distance or a character distance. It is a medical distance. It is the distance that a disease called OCD travels when it is never treated, never named, never addressed with the resources that might have changed its direction. I had $2.5 billion and the best doctors money could retain, and a staff whose entire purpose was to manage my physical environment. None of that was the resource I needed. The resource I needed was the one that did not exist in 1946 or 1956 or 1966 in any form that could have reached me through the protocols I had constructed to keep everything else out. The room was the problem. The room was also, from inside it, the only solution available. That is the specific trap of severe OCD. The behavior that is destroying you is simultaneously the only thing that feels safe. I built the room to survive. The room was what I did not survive. Those two facts coexist without resolution, the way most true things do. So now you have the architecture. The mother who counted germs. The crashes that broke something that had already been under pressure for decades. The codeine that dulled the edges just enough to make the protocols bearable, and then indispensable, and then fatal. The room that traveled from hotel to hotel across 10 years and 6 countries. Always darker, always more sealed, always one procedure away from being safe enough, which it never was, because safe enough was not a condition the room was capable of producing. I built it to survive.